From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
Capitalism is going to have a continuing fight, because if you don't have a very significant majority of the people supporting any form of institution of government, it cannot prevail indefinitely.
Former Federal Reserve Chair Alan Greenspan. He'll join us today to talk about the Iraq War, oil, President Bush's tax cuts, and why he calls Bill Clinton a Republican president. The former head of the Fed has written a memoir, The Age of Turbulence, Adventures in a New World. We'll also be joined by journalist and author Naomi Klein. Then private security firm Blackwater USA is back on the streets of Baghdad following the killing of at least 11 people. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice continues to weigh in.
It is extremely important to recognize that we're doing important work there. We need protection for our diplomats. I'm quite certain that with goodwill we can resolve this.
Iraq's Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki says the shooting deaths by Blackwater pose a serious challenge to the sovereignty of Iraq. We'll get the latest with journalist and author Jeremy Scahill. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. In Burma, as many as 100,000 anti-government protesters marched through Rangoon today in the largest protest against Burma's military junta in almost 20 years. Thousands of Buddhist monks dressed in maroon robes led the march through Burma's former capital. The monks have vowed to continue holding marches until they have, quote, wiped the military dictatorship from the land. On Saturday, monks marched to the home of Nobel Peace Laureate and pro-democracy leader Aung San Suu Kyi, who's been under house arrest since 2003. Military authorities allowed Suu Kyi to briefly greet and pray with the monks. It was her first public appearance in more than 4 years. When monks tried to march to Suu Kyi's home Sunday, government security forces blocked access to her home by setting up barbed wire barricades. In Jena, Louisiana, a judge has refused to release Michael Bell on bail. Bell is the only one of the Jena Six still behind bars. He's been in jail since December. The decision came down Friday, a day after tens of thousands of protesters marched in Jena to demand justice for the Jena Six, the 6 African-American students who face a total of over 100 years in jail for allegedly taking part in a schoolyard fight. In June, an all-white jury convicted Michael Bell of aggravated second-degree battery, but the Third Circuit Court of Appeals overturned the conviction because Bell was wrongly tried as an adult. In the neighboring town of Alexandria, Louisiana, police arrested 2 white teenagers Thursday night after they found nooses dangling from the rear of their pickup truck. One of the teenagers told police he had a KKK tattoo on his chest and said some of his relatives were involved in the Ku Klux Klan. Meanwhile, the FBI is reviewing a white supremacist website that's essentially calling for the lynching of the Jena Six. The website contains the home addresses and phone numbers of 5 of the teenagers. The owners of the website said it posted the information, quote, in case anyone wants to deliver justice. In labor news, 73,000 workers at General Motors have announced plans to go on a nationwide strike today at 11 a.m. unless the company agrees to address job security and other issues. The United Auto Workers Union and General Motors are in the middle of contract negotiations. Workers have not staged a national strike at General Motors since 1970. President Bush is expected to soon ask Congress for an additional $200 billion to pay for the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Earlier in the year, the White House outlined a request for around $147 billion, but now the Bush administration admits more money is needed. The United States is now spending $720 million a day on the war in Iraq. A recent study by the American Friends Service Committee found the cost of war for one day could buy health care for over 420,000 children. Private contractors working for Blackwater are back on the streets of Baghdad 1 week after the Iraqi government threatened to expel the company for killing at least 11 Iraqis. On Sunday, Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki said Blackwater's killing of Iraqi civilians challenged the nation's sovereignty. But due to security concerns, Iraqi officials have allowed Blackwater to resume working in Iraq. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice said the government will review the use of private security contractors like Blackwater in Iraq.
We will review expeditiously the procedures. We will review how we carry out our security, and we will have in this joint commission with the Iraqis, I think, an open and transparent view of what is going on. But it is extremely important to recognize that we're doing important work there. We need protection for our diplomats. I'm quite certain that with goodwill we can resolve this.
Iran's President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad has arrived in New York to attend the United Nations General Assembly. In an interview on 60 Minutes, Ahmadinejad said Iran was not on a path of war with the U.S. and that Iran had no need of nuclear weapons. Protests are scheduled at Columbia University today, where the Iranian president is scheduled to speak. Leaders from 80 nations are expected to take part in a special United Nations meeting today in New York to jumpstart talks on how to deal with climate change and how to replace the Kyoto Treaty. President Bush has decided to skip the meeting, but he'll attend a closed-door dinner tonight. Later this week, President Bush plans to host his own meeting on global warming. He has invited 15 countries that are major emitters of greenhouse gases to meet in Washington for 2 days. Bush hopes to persuade these countries to come to a consensus that would allow each nation to set its own policies rather than having limits imposed by a binding international treaty. The Washington Post is reporting the Department of Homeland Security is collecting detailed electronic records on the travel habits of millions of Americans who fly, drive, or take cruises abroad. The government's retaining data on the people with whom they travel or plan to stay, the personal items they carry during their journeys, and even the books that travelers have carried. In an effort to assess the security threat posed by all travelers entering the country, the Department of Homeland Security keeps these records for 15 years in the department's automated targeting system. Cuban television has aired a new interview with Fidel Castro, the first in over 3 months. In the interview, Castro warned the Bush administration could go to war with Iran.
They're going to talk about all these topics, but the dangers I'm referring to are underlining. The danger of an attack against Iran. The U.S. is making international organizations go there, to Iran. They have total control.
Castro has not been seen in public since July 31st, 2006. In other news from Latin America, Chile has extradited former Peruvian President Alberto Fujimori to Peru to face charges of corruption and sanctioning a death squad. German authorities have dropped efforts to seek the extradition of 13 CIA operatives charged in the kidnapping of German citizen Khalid al-Masri 4 years ago. A group of Chicago City Council members are calling on the Justice Department to investigate former police commander John Berg. He is accused of torturing prisoners in the 1970s and early 80s. And the world's best-known mime artist, Marcel Marceau, has died at the age of 84. For decades, he moved audiences across the globe without uttering a single word. Offstage, he often discussed the power of his art.
I'm sure that you can be young, and you have to be careful about your heart, and you can be old and have a young heart. But it's very difficult to speak about this because there is a certain injustice. Not everybody is equal. Not everybody has the same health. So there are so many people who are in difficulty of life, but you have to bring them through television, through films, through books, through art. You bring them the mystery of still dreaming and hoping until the last moment that life, I would say, can be beautiful, even if it is sometimes harsh.
Marcel Marceau has died. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. As the credit crisis continues to grow and the U.S. dollar hits a new low, we turn today to the former chair of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan. Alan Greenspan headed the central bank in the United States for almost 2 decades. He was first appointed to this position in 1987 by President Ronald Reagan. Greenspan retired in January 2006 after deciding the fate of national interest rates under 4 different presidents. Dubbed the Maestro, He was widely regarded as one of the world's most influential economic policymakers. He's just written a new 500-page memoir. It's called The Age of Turbulence: Adventures in a New World. Alan Greenspan joins us now on the phone. And in our studio, we're joined again by journalist Naomi Klein, author of The Shock Doctrine. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Welcome, Alan Greenspan.
Thank you very much.
It's good to have you with us. You worked with 6 presidents, with President Reagan, with both President Bushes. You worked with President Ford, and you worked with Bill Clinton, who you have called a Republican president. Why?
That was supposed to be a quasi-joke.
Talk about it.
Well, you mean Clinton?
Yes.
Well, I've stated that I'm a libertarian Republican, which means I believe in a series of issues such as smaller government, constraint on budget deficits, free markets, globalization, and a whole series of other things, including welfare reform. As you may remember, Bill Clinton was pretty much in the same, was doing much that same agenda. And so I got to consider him someone, as he described it, as we were both an odd couple, because he is a centrist Democrat, and that's not all that far from libertarian republicanism.
About how much would you say you agreed with him?
Oh, on economic issues, I would say probably 80%.
And what about President Bush?
President Bush had the wonderful characteristic of knowing that it was not to his advantage or ours to interfere with the actions of the Federal Reserve. And I must say, through all of his years, he never once second-guessed what the Fed was doing. And that was very important to us, and we've been very much appreciative of that. But as I say in the book, he did not clamp down, as I thought was necessary, on what was a wayward Republican-controlled Congress, which I thought lost its way and started to spend and create all sorts of fiscal imbalances. And essentially what I hold, where I thought the administration could have done far better, is if the veto were employed. And as you may remember, he did not use the veto at all. And that what I thought would have created a much more balanced procedure in the Congress. It's a mixed case in this regard.
Alan Greenspan, let's talk about the war in Iraq. You said what for many in your circles is the unspeakable, that the war in Iraq was for oil. Can you explain?
Yes. The point I was making was that if there were no oil under the sands of Iraq, Saddam Hussein would have never been able to accumulate the resources which enabled him to threaten his neighbors, Iran, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. And having watched him for 30 years, I was very fearful that if he ever achieved, and I thought he might very well be able to buy one, an atomic device, he would have essentially endeavored and perhaps succeeded in controlling the flow of oil through the Straits of Hormuz, which is the channel through which about 18 or 19 million barrels a day of the world 85 million barrel crude oil production flows. Had he decided to shut down, say, 7 million barrels a day, which he could have done if he controlled, he could have essentially also shut down a significant part of economic activity throughout the world. The size of the threat that he posed, as I saw it emerging, I thought was scary. And so getting him out of office